Hey, you're here with Fatal Files. In today's episode, I'm going through live reports that ended up capturing someone's horrifying final moments instead of the story they came to cover. From a keeper mauled by a jaguar in the middle of a live zoo segment, to a painter thrown from a suspended scaffold before being smashed back into the building. It was September 18, 2017. A zoo outside Tampa, Florida, was hosting a short live morning segment on how keepers checked large predators safely, with the camera set up beside the jaguar service area while staff prepared for the demonstration. At 43, Felix Bell had spent nearly 10 years working as a carnivore keeper at the zoo. He regularly handled jaguar feeding, cleaning, and protected contact training, while maintenance of the transfer doors and locking hardware belonged to another department. Co-workers knew him as careful with the routines that kept staff and animals separated. With that much experience, Felix was not treating the jaguar casually. He was trusting a system he had used for years. Felix began the segment beside a steel mesh barrier with one of the zoo's jaguars on the other side. Using a target stick and small food rewards, he guided the animal along the fence and showed how keepers could inspect its paws, shoulders, and movement without ever sharing the same space. The jaguar stayed calm throughout the demonstration. It followed the target, took food normally, and showed no sign of agitation. Once that part was finished, another keeper shifted the jaguar into an off-exhibit holding pen. Felix waited for confirmation that the transfer door was closed before entering the service corridor connected to the holding area to collect a training board and food container for the last part of the segment. It makes you realize how much of this job depends on handoffs. Felix had to trust that confirmation enough to keep working. The reporter kept talking while the camera held a wide shot that still included Felix near the service area. Behind him, the jaguar pushed against the transfer door. Something lodged in the lower track had stopped the door just short of fully closing. From the corridor, it still sat almost flush with the frame, so the small gap was easy to miss, even though the lock had never fully engaged. The jaguar hooked a paw against the edge and worked the opening wider, then pushed its shoulder through until the door moved farther. The camera operator noticed the movement and called Felix's attention to it. He turned just as the jaguar came through and grabbed the training board beside him, holding it between them while backing toward the service gate. The jaguar knocked the board aside and brought Felix down near the fencing. It bit into his upper shoulder as he tried to turn away, then shifted higher and clamped onto the side and back of his neck. Felix raised an arm between himself and the animal, but the jaguar bit through his sleeve and raked across his upper chest before biting into his neck again. From behind the service barrier, another keeper discharged a fire extinguisher toward the jaguar. The animal broke away from Felix long enough for staff to open an adjacent holding pen and draw it inside. Once the transfer gate was secured, employees confirmed that the service area was safe for paramedics to enter. The station cut away during the attack. Felix was still alive when paramedics reached him. He had deep bite wounds to the neck and upper chest, heavy bleeding, and swelling around his airway that made breathing increasingly difficult. They controlled the bleeding as much as possible, supported his breathing, and transported him to a nearby trauma center. His condition continued to deteriorate at the hospital. The injuries had damaged major blood vessels in his neck and upper chest, and doctors were unable to control the blood loss. Felix went into cardiac arrest during emergency treatment and could not be revived. It was determined that he died from severe neck and chest trauma with massive blood loss caused by the jaguar attack. His death was recorded as accidental. Investigators found debris packed into the lower track of the transfer door, which had stopped it just short of its fully closed position. Because the door sat almost flush with the frame, it appeared secure from the service corridor, even though the locking mechanism had not fully engaged. The carnivore building stayed closed while the zoo inspected the transfer gates and tracks. Staff changed the cleaning checks around the recess tracks and added a physical check to confirm each door was fully closed before anyone entered a connected enclosure. The station did not rebroadcast the attack in full. There is something pretty sobering about being good at your job and still being vulnerable to a mistake that happened outside your part of it. In Reno, an escape artist hung above a live theater stage when one sudden drop turned the act into something nobody in the audience expected. It was November 7, 2016. A small hotel theater in Reno, Nevada was featured during a local evening broadcast about long-running entertainment acts in the city. Tristan Corbin was 36, and performing had taken him through small theaters, casino lounges, and hotel showrooms around Nevada. He was never a household name, but restraint escapes and close-up illusions kept him working regularly. His suspended escape had become one of the more familiar acts in his show, and both Tristan and the stage crew knew the routine well. The television crew arrived during the second half of the show and planned to stay live for only a few minutes. Tristan's act happened to fall inside that window. Before he came out, stagehands checked the overhead rig, motorized hoist, and secondary arrest system as they normally did before the routine. Most people watching a stunt like this are looking at the restraints. The crew has a completely different list of things they need to trust above and around him. Basically, Tristan was strapped upright inside a narrow metal frame that would be lifted above the stage. The whole point of the act was for him to free his wrists, waist, and chest while hanging in the air, with a concealed safety harness keeping his torso secured to the frame the entire time. Once the frame was raised, Tristan started working through the restraints one by one. He freed his wrists first, then the strap around his waist, and finally reached for the one across his chest while the presenter talked from the side. Everything looked normal until Tristan released the last strap. The frame was supposed to stay still for a moment and then lower slowly, but instead, it suddenly dropped several feet before the backup system caught it. The stop was hard enough to snap Tristan's head forward and back while the frame swung beneath the rig. He stayed hanging there with his head dropped forward. His body had gone largely limp and his mouth stayed open as he took short, shallow breaths. His chest was barely moving. The crew stopped the music and started bringing the frame down with the emergency system. By the time Tristan reached the stage, his breathing had become slower and weaker. Stagehands supported his head and shoulders as they took him out of the frame and lowered him onto the floor. A medic reached him almost immediately, while another employee called emergency services. Tristan was unconscious by then and barely breathing. The medic kept his neck still, opened his airway, and began assisted ventilation. Paramedics arrived within minutes, fitted a cervical collar, and continued supporting his breathing during the trip to a nearby hospital. Scans showed severe damage high in Tristan's neck, including catastrophic injury to the upper cervical spinal cord. The injury had interrupted the nerve signals required for normal breathing. His heart stopped during treatment, and attempts to revive him were unsuccessful. Doctors concluded that the sudden stop had caused a fatal injury high in Tristan's cervical spine, leaving him unable to breathe normally. The death was treated as an accident linked to the hoist failure. The theater canceled the rest of the show and took the rig out of service. Investigators examined the hoist, brake assembly, control wiring, and secondary arrest system. Testing later found an intermittent electrical fault in the hoist controller that briefly disengaged the holding brake, allowing several feet of line to pay out before the secondary system caught the frame. Intermittent problems are nasty because they can disappear the second somebody goes looking for them. That makes it much harder to know whether the equipment is actually safe again or simply behaving for the moment. The station later provided the live recording to investigators, and the footage helped them measure how far the frame dropped and how abruptly it stopped when the backup system caught it. The backup system had kept Tristan from hitting the stage, but the sudden stop severely damaged the spinal cord high in his neck and left him unable to breathe on his own. The suspended escape was removed from the theater's program, and the remaining aerial equipment was inspected before performances resumed. You usually judge an escape artist by whether he can get himself out. This story makes you think about all the things he has to trust before he ever gets that chance. In Jaipur, the next death unfolded in the background of a live procession as a metal frame rose dangerously close to the wires overhead. It was March 26, 2018. A local television crew in Jaipur, Rajasthan, was carrying a short live update from a religious procession moving through a crowded neighborhood intersection. The presenter stood on a shop balcony while one camera looked down over the groups passing below. Arjun Kapoor worked in inventory for a wholesale clothing business in Jaipur. He was 39 and had volunteered with the procession for years, usually helping move larger decorations through the route. That afternoon, he joined several other men carrying a tall ceremonial structure. Most of its lower handholds were painted wood and wrapped supports, but one exposed metal rail ran down Arjun's side, and that was where he took his grip. A painted wooden handhold and a bare metal rail probably do not feel very different when you are just trying to keep something heavy balanced. Electrically, of course, they are completely different things. Arjun had nothing to do with the television report. He first appeared only as one person among dozens moving through the background while the presenter talked about the procession below. That detail changes the feel of the footage for me. Arjun was not there for the broadcast at all, but the camera still ended up recording the last part of his day. The group had carried the structure through wider streets without trouble. At the intersection, parked motorcycles and spectators narrowed the route, so the carriers turned it sideways. One end rose as they moved beneath the power lines, and nobody noticed how close the upper frame had come. The top of the metal frame contacted the line, and a bright flash broke across the structure. Arjun's whole body tightened against the metal, but his hands did not come away. His fingers stayed locked around the rail, while his arms pulled stiff against his sides, and his legs straightened beneath him. The other carriers dropped their sections almost immediately and moved clear. The structure began tipping sideways, but Arjun remained attached to the exposed rail as it shifted. His head pulled back, then dropped forward while his body continued jerking against the metal. One of his legs kicked unevenly beneath him as another muscle contraction ran through his body, but his hands still would not release. As the structure fell farther toward the curb, its upper section finally moved away from the power line. The electrical contact broke. Arjun's grip released, and he dropped beside the frame. The live camera captured the flash, and the structure falling before the station switched away from the intersection. People moved toward Arjun, but stopped when they saw the metal frame beside him. It was no longer touching the line, and nobody wanted to risk getting shocked, too. One side of his clothing was scorched, and he lay motionless beside the frame. Police kept people back while the utility shut off power to that part of the street. Arjun remained beside the frame for several minutes before responders were told it was safe to approach. They pulled him clear, found no pulse or breathing, and started CPR immediately. Resuscitation continued in the ambulance and at the hospital, but his heartbeat never returned. Doctors found electrical burns on his hand and upper body. The current had traveled through his torso and caused his heart to stop beating normally. Arjun was pronounced dead shortly after reaching the hospital, with electrocution given as the cause of death. The investigation focused on the procession route and the height of the ceremonial structure. Measurements taken afterward showed that the frame could pass beneath the lines while held level, but turning it at the crowded intersection raised one side high enough to reach the overhead conductor. The station provided its recording to investigators, who also measured the structure and inspected the intersection. No fault was found with the power line, and the frame's height and position were identified as the cause of contact. Afterward, organizers had to declare the height of large structures before routes were approved, and taller metal displays were kept away from low overhead lines. There's a strange contrast in a day built around faith and celebration, leaving his family with a completely different memory of it. At a road course outside Lexington, Ohio, a live race crash sent one heavy piece of the car toward a marshal post where nobody expected the danger to reach. It was August 15, 2015. A road course outside Lexington, Ohio, was hosting a regional open-wheel race that afternoon, with a sports network carrying the event live from cameras positioned around the circuit. Hayden Lewis was 47 and had been volunteering as a track marshal for several seasons. He had always been into racing, but he liked being down near the course more than watching from the stands. Most of the job was pretty routine, like watching his section, reporting debris, handling flags, and waiting for race control to tell him when it was safe to move. Most people watch the cars. Hayden's job was to watch his section of the track, but that still does not mean you can track every piece of debris once a crash starts throwing things in different directions. Hayden's post sat just beyond one of the faster corners on the course, close enough that the broadcast cameras regularly caught that section whenever cars came through. That put him within the live shot several times during the race, usually standing behind the barrier with the other marshals. Being that close probably gives you a completely different sense of speed than watching from the stands. The cars are not just fast anymore, they are right there. Midway through the afternoon, two cars came together while fighting for position. One was pushed sideways and struck the outside barrier at an angle, tearing apart part of the front suspension. The television camera stayed with the damaged car as it spun to a stop. A wheel and hub assembly separated during the impact. Instead of stopping near the wreck, it bounced across the edge of the track, struck the barrier, and kept moving along the outside of the corner. Each bounce changed its height and direction, making its path difficult to predict. The loose wheel was already heading toward Hayden's section when he finally saw it. He turned and managed one step deeper into the marshal post before the assembly reached him. The wheel struck the side of Hayden's face and upper body and drove him backward into the metal barrier behind the post. For a moment, he was pinned between the assembly and the barrier before the wheel dropped away and continued farther down the course. Hayden collapsed beside the equipment box. One side of his face had taken most of the impact, leaving obvious swelling and damage around his cheek and jaw, with blood around his nose and mouth. He remained completely unresponsive, with one arm folded beneath him and his radio several feet away. The live camera was still following the crashed car, but the loose wheel remained visible near the edge of the shot. Viewers could see it leave the wreck, reach Hayden's position, and knock him backward before the broadcast changed angles. The marshals nearby alerted race control, and a red flag was thrown, so a medical vehicle already positioned around the circuit could drive directly to the post. When the team reached Hayden, he was unresponsive, with no detectable pulse and no normal breathing. They began resuscitation beside the barrier, but there was no meaningful response. Hayden was pronounced dead at the circuit. Doctors later found multiple fractures through the bones on one side of his face and skull, along with severe brain injury. The same impact had crushed several ribs and caused major damage and bleeding inside his chest. The combined head and chest injuries caused his death. Race officials stopped the event and kept the damaged car, detached wheel, suspension pieces, and onboard data for examination. Investigators found that the crash had destroyed enough of the suspension and tether attachment structure for the wheel assembly to separate from the car. The wheel tether had been installed, but the crash badly damaged the structure supporting it. Footage and nearby marshals helped confirm that the wheel struck the barrier first and was redirected toward Hayden's post. The driver was cleared of responsibility, with officials finding that the wheel's path resulted from the crash damage and its impact with the barrier. You usually think of the danger staying with the drivers, but Hayden's story is a reminder that the people working trackside can definitely be inside that risk too. On a high-rise in Guadalajara, a live street report caught a mural worker far above the ground when something on the outside of the building began to give way. It was April 9, 2017. A local news crew in Guadalajara, Jalisco, was doing a live evening report about a newly finished mural covering the side of a commercial building. The reporter stood across the street so the artwork filled most of the shot. At 34, Thomas Lozano made his living wherever a paint job required someone willing to work high above the pavement. Murals were only part of it. He also painted signs, restored exterior walls, and coated building facades, so suspended platforms were a regular part of his work. He was finishing a protective coating near the upper part of the mural before packing up for the day. That mix of jobs tells you Thomas was used to adapting to whatever surface or building he was given. The height was part of the work, not the whole identity of it. From across the street, Thomas became part of the live shot simply because he was working directly over the mural being discussed. He was basically background in a story about the mural, which makes the footage feel different once you know what it ended up capturing. Several minutes into the report, one end of the scaffold began dropping slightly. Thomas stopped painting and grabbed the rail while his co-worker moved toward the opposite end. The platform continued leaning until buckets and tools started sliding toward the lower side. That was when attention on the street shifted upward. The low side suddenly dropped several feet. Thomas lost his footing and went over the rail, but his separate safety line caught him before he fell very far. His body swung back into the building, striking the wall, and he ended up hanging partly underneath the tilted scaffold. The live camera caught the platform dropping and Thomas disappearing over its side. The reporter moved out of the shot, while the camera stayed on the building long enough to show that Thomas was still hanging beneath it. Thomas pushed one hand against the wall and tried to reposition himself, but his safety line had slipped around the lower corner of the tilted tilted platform during the swing. The tension in the line pulled him tightly against the scaffold's lower edge, leaving his upper chest pressed against the metal, while the harness held the rest of his weight and his legs hung below. Workers called for emergency help, and firefighters arrived with equipment to reach him from the roof. Thomas was still moving when they began setting up above him, but rescuers first had to take his weight onto another line before they could free the one trapped around the platform. As the minutes passed, Thomas began struggling more noticeably. He tried to lift his chest away from the platform and repeatedly shifted his shoulders against the harness. His breaths became shorter, and he stopped being able to hold himself away from the metal for more than a few seconds at a time. Firefighters lowered a rescuer from the roof and attached Thomas to a separate rescue line. By then, his movements had slowed. His head kept falling forward, and eventually his arms dropped away from the scaffold altogether. Once his weight was transferred onto the rescue system, firefighters freed the trapped line and lowered him to the street. Thomas was unconscious and taking only occasional weak breaths when he reached the ground. His pulse disappeared during treatment, and the ambulance crew continued trying to restore a heartbeat on the way to the hospital. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The examination afterward showed heavy bruising across Thomas's chest and upper abdomen, but the original swing into the wall had not caused a fatal internal injury. His chest had remained compressed against the tilted scaffold, while the harness and trapped line held him in place, gradually preventing him from breathing effectively. The final cause was listed as compressive asphyxia following the scaffold failure. Investigators traced the initial drop to a malfunction in one of the platform's powered hoists. The separate safety line had done exactly what it was supposed to do by stopping Thomas from falling to the street, but his position beneath the tilted platform left him trapped against its lower edge. The contractor took its other suspended platforms out of service for inspection, and the failed hoist was removed. Investigators found no fault with the rescue response. That is the odd part of high-rise work. The job can look like it is about paint, glass, concrete, whatever is in front of you, while so much of your safety depends on the hardware around you.